We are thrilled to have you here tonight and welcome you to the presentation, Where Will My Student Live Next Fall? As I said, my name is Rachel and I am here with some of my colleagues, so I am going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves. I'm going in order of my screen, so Saj, if you can go ahead and get started and introduce yourself and then just go around.
Hi, my name's Saj. I'm the MFamily program graduate intern, so I work with Rachel and Nicole on all things parents and families. I'll pass it on to Nicole.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Nicole Banks. I'm one of the Associate Deans of Students. I'm happy to be here tonight, and the noise you hear in the background is my dog, Bailey. I'll turn it over to Travis.
Good evening, everyone. I am Travis Martin. I am excited to be with you all this evening. I am one of the other Associate Deans of Students, and I also serve as the Director of Fraternity and Sorority Life here at Michigan, and excited to talk with you all a little bit more about the opportunities we have for living. And I will maybe pass the baton to Michael.
Good evening. My name is Michael Zabriskie. I'm the Associate Director in Michigan Housing, and I'll pass it to Mark.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Simmons. I am the Program Manager for Beyond the Diag in the Dean of Students Office, which is the program that provides support and resources to students living off campus.
Thank you, everyone. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started tonight. This conversation will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. We do have an MFamily YouTube channel, and it hosts all of the recordings that we have throughout the school year. Additionally, if you have any questions tonight, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom. We will use that to compile any questions until the end of the conversation. We will hold all questions till the end of the conversation. My colleagues will be compiling those, and then at the end of the session, we will try to get to as many questions as we can. If we don't get to your question tonight, within a week of the conclusion of this, we will send out the questions and answers via email, along with the link to the YouTube channel. So don't worry if you have to leave early or you have to step out for a minute. We will record, we will post it on YouTube, and you will have the whole presentation along with any questions and answers you may have. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. All right. So welcome. As I said before, we introduced everyone. This is just the slide of everyone's name and who they are. I'll send the slide set out along with the question and answers and the link to the YouTube channel, so you will have this when we are done. So this conversation is intended to provide an overhead or an overview of housing, discuss things that you may want to keep in mind or discuss with your student when you're looking at housing options for next year, and then allow you to ask questions of our U of M staff here at the university, allow you to talk through some of your questions with them, get answers from our on-campus housing staff, our fraternity and sorority life staff, and our off-campus housing staff. So we hope that you enjoy this and that it's useful. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Michael to talk about on-campus housing.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So we welcome students to participate in a returning resident process in January. Unfortunately, space for returning students is somewhat limited, and approximately 15% of our current residents are able to return for another year. In order to participate and look for rooms, students must apply for housing via the returning resident housing process to be eligible to participate. There's no commitment by applying, so we encourage students to complete this step. Now, what I will say is the students will apply in the same place they applied for housing the first time around, which is in the Michigan Business Portal. So students should expect to complete their housing application for next year within that site, as well as contracts and anything else that they'd be doing that's official housing business. Okay. So our timeline, as I mentioned, really, we don't start our returning resident housing process until January. We will have additional information up on our website shortly. We're finalizing some dates, but safe to say that there's nothing the students need to do for on-campus housing activity-wise until they return in January. They will get emails from housing@umech.edu, and those emails will direct students to the housing portal in order to complete the necessary steps to participate. Students will also receive emails notifying them of upcoming deadlines. So please encourage them to read any emails they receive from housing@umech. Thank you.
And thank you, Michael. I am going to now turn the presentation over to Travis Martin.
Hi. Good evening again, everyone. I wanted to start by introducing you all to the fraternity sorority community here at the University of Michigan. In this picture here is our lovely home base, which our office is located at 1443 Washington Avenue, which is conveniently located to a number of our chapter facilities, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But first, it may be important to know that fraternity sorority life here at Michigan is made up of 4 governing councils, and those 4 councils, with each having fraternities and sororities in them, is made up of the Interfraternity Council, which is all men's organizations, our Multicultural Greek Council, which does consist of both men's and women's organizations, our National Panhellenic Council, which also is made up of both men's and women's organizations, and our Panhellenic Association, which is all women's organizations. And so collectively, we make up about approximately 55 different fraternities and sororities across those 4 councils. Our Multicultural Greek Council and our National Panhellenic Council are what we would consider our culturally based fraternal organizations. So our Divine Nine, many folks may have heard of them, as well as organizations that might serve different ethnic or cultural interests for students and finding sense of belonging on campus. We also have both the Panhellenic Association and Interfraternity Council have member organizations that have recognized chapter housing, and although they are considered off campus, they are more recognized by the university as congregate living space for students on campus. It may be important to note that these particular chapter facilities are independently owned and operated. So whereas the Fraternity Sorority Life office doesn't manage them directly, we work very closely with either the local alumni or the National Housing Board to help support the student experience as a part of living in those chapter facilities. And so we do think that there's some benefits for those who might choose to join a fraternity or sorority that have a recognized chapter housing. There are benefits to living in them, right? And so some of those benefits is that they offer very competitive rates, believe it or not, often less than what you might find in the surrounding area. We have the benefit of also offering 8-month leases because they try to align them with the academic year. And specifically, our Panhellenic chapters also have a live-in house director. So it's a live-in adult staff hired by the sorority or fraternity or the local alumni board to support the members who are living in those chapter facilities as well. And then some of our IFC chapters have live-in advisors who live in those facilities as well. And so the amenities across those facilities vary. So it really depends on which organization your student end up joining. But many of them do have designated on-site chefs or catering meals. Some of them offer exercise rooms and study spaces and parking as a part of that experience as well. And so we can go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about, in particular, the obligations. And so it's important to note that if your student is interested and you know they've been talking about joining a sorority and fraternity, particularly our Panhell sororities, all of them require that their chapter facilities be full. So many of the local housing alumni board or the National Housing Board would mandate to the chapter that they have a process in place to ensure that the facility is full. And each sorority do have different room capacity depending on their chapter facility that they have. And then also our IFC fraternities, although not as many of them, maybe not as structured and strict in terms of filling the facility, they do require that the chapter have enough residents in them to operate the facility successfully, right? Generally, when a student joins a fraternity or sorority here at Michigan, they tend to live in the chapter facility the year after they join. So if your student is a first-year student here, they will join this year. and they typically will move in their sophomore year, right? And so with some exceptions, right? And if a student is planning to join a fraternity, we always encourage students to not sign a lease, particularly in the fall or prior to them joining, right? And many of you know our Panhellenic sororities in particular do their primary recruitment in January. And so we really do encourage women or any student that's choosing to go through the Panhellenic recruitment process to hold off from signing a lease until you can figure out any housing requirements as a result of joining. And typically should a student join, that actual housing requirement will be identified immediately following them receiving a bid to join their sorority. So they'll be able to at least have some understanding around what may be required of them as a new member at that time. And certainly if your student has joined a fraternity this fall, ideally they've already got an idea of whether they're going to be living in the chapter facility or not. But if there's any questions, we can always help facilitate any questions along with parents and or students with their alumni or Fraternity National Housing Board. And we always encourage folks, and I know there's a lot of anxiety around waiting, particularly students who may be feeling this pressure to sign a lease. As sometimes it's kind of in our culture here at Michigan, we always encourage students that there are still housing options available, sometimes through Michigan Housing, but also Beyond the Diag can help students who might need assistance if they maybe go through the process and they decide at some point, well, I don't necessarily know if I want to join a sorority. I choose to not join, and now I need to find off-campus housing. And so Beyond the Diag is here to assist students in being able to support your student in finding actually housing option off campus. And Mark can talk a little bit more about Beyond the Diag and the timing and what might be available, particularly in that time of the year, should there be any other questions. And so I'll now pass it over to Mark from Beyond the Diag.
Thanks, Travis. So I'm just going to give a little bit of context and history for the program, just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So Beyond the Diag was established in 2011, so it's been in operation now. I guess that's about 13 years. It is part of the Dean of Students Office, so it's part of the group of programs that we provide to students to provide support and resources to students. It focuses on providing resources, communication, education, and support for students who are either currently living off campus or are preparing to live off campus. And that comes in the form of both staff support and also peer support through student employees that we employ to provide that support and assistance, and also provide some proactive engagement and educational opportunities. They appear in a whole number of different ways, including housing fairs, and I'll say more about that later, but various programming events that take place through the year, and lots of other opportunities, both in-person and virtual opportunities. So here are just a couple of links that may be useful for folks to note down. The off-campus housing listing service, or sometimes referred to as our off-campus housing search website. This is really where we would direct people to begin that housing search process. So this is the university's dedicated off-campus housing platform. And if you are searching for housing in and around Ann Arbor, for your student to live in, if they are not going to live in university housing, then this is the website that we'd encourage you to use. You can see there additionally, there's a separate link for the intercooperative councils, or sometimes called co-ops in the city. That is a slightly different format of living. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the co-ops and how they're organized and how they operate. But if you want to learn more about the co-op living environment and how that operates, that can sometimes be appealing to people, both in terms of the way they're configured and also often come in at a lower price point. So that may also be something you want to consider as well. So thinking in terms of the kinds of questions and the kinds of things that we would encourage for you to be thinking about when you're in conversation with your student and you're preparing and they're preparing to begin that process of searching for housing off campus. The lease is obviously a legally binding contract. Oftentimes it may be the first time that a student has signed a legally binding contract like this. that commits them to something for a term, for a period of time, and there's usually thousands of dollars attached to that. So we would strongly encourage students to get their leases reviewed by Student Legal Services. Student Legal Services are fully licensed attorneys with specific expertise in housing law, and they will review the lease with the student free of charge. Of course, we'd encourage that to happen before the student signs the lease, because if there's something in there that they're concerned about, the student can step back. But even if the student has already signed the lease, they're still happy to work with the student and identify any questions or issues there might be. Think through things like what are the rights and responsibilities that the housing provider is asking from the student. Be aware of things like safety and scams, who you're giving your information to, how you're sharing that information. Does that match the best practice guidance that we at the university are giving you about when and how to share personal information? Think about things like transportation. How is the student planning to get to and from their property? Are they planning to have their own vehicle? Are they planning to use public transportation? Really important to think about your roommate. And that roommate selection can often be the difference between a really positive living experience and a challenging living experience. Think about things like, your approach to visitors, your approach to social time, your approach to quiet time and study, chores, bill payment. These are all things that are really important to have those conversations up front at the beginning, before you make a commitment, and then you quickly realize that you're living with someone that's going to be challenging. We know that conflict does arise even with the best will in the world, and we can be helpful in helping to navigate that. Of course, we try and ask those questions ahead of time to avoid conflict, but if conflict does arise, then the Beyond the Diag team can be helpful in navigating that conflict, even if it's between roommates or sometimes between a housing provider and students, and see if there is a solution or a path forward to resolve that conflict. As part of smart money management and planning ahead, we encourage students to budget and think about what their budget will be. Make sure that you're keeping in mind things like utilities and additional fees, and make sure that is a budget that feels affordable and sustainable for you. So there's a couple of other things. There are different types of lease and different lengths of lease. Those can be useful. I will say that the vast majority of off-campus leases in Ann Arbor tend to be 12 months long. So be aware of that, even if you may only need your lease for 8 or 9 months out of the year. In most cases, a landlord will ask you for a 12-month commitment, and they're not necessarily going to let you out of that lease early just because you're ready to move out. We do encourage all students to purchase renters insurance. Landlords will normally have their building insured, but if there's a problem or an issue that causes damage to your property as the tenant, that will not be insured by the landlord normally. And so we'd strongly encourage students to buy renters insurance to ensure that their property is protected if it ever gets damaged. An inventory checklist is also really important, just in terms of making sure that any damage or any issues are identified and they don't end up being the responsibility of the students. There are several city ordinances that relate to renting in Ann Arbor. I'm not going to spend too long going through those because we could do an entire separate presentation on those. But it's important that you understand what those ordinances mean in terms of when students can view properties, when they can sign leases, and when landlords are asking you for different things, whether it's asking you to commit to something in writing or potentially asking you for payments and fees. Just being aware of what it is you're committing to, being aware of, if you're being asked for a down payment or a wait list fee or something like that. What are the circumstances in which that might get refunded to you? Is it non-refundable? What does that mean? Those are all things to be aware of. There is information on the City of Ann Arbor website about those ordinances. And again, we would strongly encourage you to be aware of those ordinances prior to signing a lease. We developed a campaign several years ago in conjunction with a number of other campus partners. And this is a series of videos that are available on our website. You can see the hyperlink there at the top of the page. But it's called the Take Time Before You Sign campaign, and it really walks through a number of the steps that we encourage you to think through and walk through before you get to that point of signing a lease. Each video, I think there's 7 videos. Each video is about a minute to a minute and a half long, so they're very short, very digestible, and they really just walk through those simple step-by-step parts of that process. Everything from thinking about roommates to where and how do you search for housing, to questions to ask your landlord, the signing of the lease, budgeting, and each piece of that process, just so you really feel prepared and ready to then complete that process. So I mentioned housing fairs. That is a really important way that we try and get information in front of students and give them an opportunity to connect with housing providers. There is a housing fair taking place tomorrow. There was a virtual housing fair last week, and there is a housing fair, in-person housing fair taking place tomorrow. You can see there on the screen, it starts at 10 a.m. It will be in the ballroom of the Michigan League building, which is right in the center of Central Campus. As I say, that is an opportunity to meet with many of the Ann Arbor area housing providers and landlords. It's a great opportunity to ask those properties questions, find out about different options. There will also be campus partners there. So folks who provide support and resources to students living off campus will be there as well to let students know how they can be helpful, what they can do to support. And oftentimes you'll have housing providers who are giving away all kinds of freebies and gifts and incentives and different things. Important to understand, this is not an event where anyone is going to be paying money or anyone is going to be signing any contracts. This is a purely informational event where students can find out about housing, can learn about housing, and can hear from landlords what those housing options might look like. And we want students to feel like they have that opportunity to gather that information prior to them moving forward with that housing search process.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
I am going to allow our compilers to compile the question and answers. If you have any questions, again, please use the Q&A tool in Zoom to submit your questions, and Nicole and Saj will be furiously compiling and be ready to ask our presenters in just a moment. This slide is just a winter registration reminder. So it's a great time to talk with your student, if you haven't already, about winter registration. Backpack, which is the platform that they use to register, opens on November 11th. And then there are rolling appointments for students to register for classes. They will receive an appointment, and they can view that in their Wolverine Access, and then they will sign up for classes through Backpack. So if your student hasn't talked to you about it, or if you're curious as to what courses they are taking next semester, this is a great time to have a discussion with them, get thinking about some of the things that they may be doing next semester. Again, we are going to have a Q&A session. So if we are ready to go, I will turn it over to Saj and Nicole to start with that.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the early adopters and folks who started submitting questions. You may hear your question is kind of grouped with other questions. I'm going to cover them in a couple different ways and try to answer things. A number of things were asked moments before the speaker talked about it, so I hope that's helpful. But be patient if you don't hear your exact phrasing asked, because again, a number of ideas were repeated in questions. So I will start with Michael Zabriskie. You talked earlier in your remarks about returning students' opportunities for living on campus. There's a two-part question here. The first is, can you talk more about, you made reference to 15%, I believe. Can you talk more about that space and what it looks like in comparison to the average number of applications you get? And then the second part of that question has to do with the South Fifth development, the new housing that is being built and coming online soon. Can you also talk a little bit about what plans might be for, well, how those new facilities will support continuing students' opportunities to live on campus?
Both good questions. So the South Fifth development will not be opening until fall 2026. So not this coming year, but the year after. We're all excited to have it open. It'll be about 2,300 beds. That will permit us to offer more housing to returning students. So just I can't give you specific numbers about that, but it will increase our overall capacity, which will benefit returning students as well as new students. For the first question, 15% for us is approximately 1,000 beds or so in our system. So about 1,000 returning students, excluding our student staff, have the opportunity to reside on campus. Most spaces that are available are singles and triple rooms. We reserve most of our double rooms for incoming first year students, so we can ensure that they have the roommate experience. So space we will have spaces that we'll have double spaces that are available, but they will be fewer than the singles and the triples that are available.
Thank you. This is a related question. So I'm going to sneak this in before I move on to another panelist. But for students who have disabilities who live on campus right now, and I'm going to make the assumption to modify that and say physical disabilities, are there ways that they can request housing on campus in the future and present that information um, to help their application?
We have the students go through the same process as any returning student would. And as a part of that process, they're able to disclose any needs that they might have. And for some students, those might be the same needs as this year. And we'll be able to work with those students to determine how all that will play into the overall process. But typically, we treat those students the same in the sense in terms of order and placement. So we might encourage them to participate in the process, choose a room, and then we will meet their accommodation after they've chosen a room. So that way they're in line to select for spaces like the remainder of the student population.
Thank you. I'm going to move along to Travis. Travis, there's a couple questions here about fraternity and sorority off-campus living, because chapter facilities, as you mentioned, are technically off-campus. Can you say a little more? I think you touched on these things, but can you say a little bit more about the amenities in those chapter facilities? And some of the questions are addressing like dietary restrictions and opportunities to work with the on-site staff for meals that are appropriate.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, certainly I think the amenities do vary pretty significantly across the different fraternities or sorority facilities. And however, what I do know is that many of the organizations are very much used to supporting students who might have restrictions around dietary concerns. And so I think as a student is going through the new member process, and if as they receive a bid, actually even as they're going through the recruitment process, I think we encourage students to ask those questions early on, right? Is it possible for a fraternity or sorority to accommodate, said dietary restrictions or any other amenity needs that a person has, and use that as a decision maker around whether a student want to move forward with joining that particular fraternity or sorority. But I do know I can speak to from our awareness that for the most part, chapters do make every effort to accommodate any students, particularly around dietary concerns across the different facilities, right? So.
Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned that I'm sorry, living in chapter facilities is associated with membership in those specific organizations that offer housing. There is a question here about where people can get more information about chapter housing in general. I know there's an FSL website But if you want to mention it, or if you can help me look for it and maybe drop it, maybe we can put it in chat so that people who are interested in chapter housing and seeing some comparisons and descriptions will have that. You're muted still.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say our sororities have done a really excellent job at really compiling data around our housing, their housing options, and providing that to us. So if you go out to the FSL website under the tab Our Community, under Panhellenic Association, you can then search for, and I'll drop also this into Nicole to include in the answer sessions that'll do the follow up. But there is a tab under Panhellenic Association and a quick link on the Panhellenic Association page that says financial and housing information. The Panhellenic sororities have done a good job in compiling all of their housing amenities and information together and being really transparent around that. The fraternities, not so much, but we can certainly, if there's a particular fraternity that your student is interested in, we can certainly facilitate again those requests for information, or if you have any specific questions, we can also and we do that all the time, facilitate asking questions or getting additional information you might have around a particular fraternity.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move to Beyond the Diag and off-campus housing and the information that touching further on some of the information that you shared, Mark. And I want to just start with a caveat because there's several references to, and I believe this is coming from families of first-year students, but they're making references to what they heard in orientation about the timeline for looking for off-campus housing. And a couple people are sitting with this notion that their students are feeling a pressure to do it now, or it started in October. But during the formal orientation sessions, and these may have even been my remarks, that there will be students who look for housing as early as possible, like in October of a given year, but that there tends to be enough inventory available for people to find housing later in the year. But can you talk about availability of rental options for students who may not lease before December or January, like what they might expect?
Yes, and thank you for that, Nicole. So I'm going to take that question in a couple of pieces. We know that every year a combination of the let's say student to student culture of knowledge sharing, which is probably mostly kind of word of mouth and how students exchange information with each other. And also housing providers themselves will communicate the importance of finding housing during the fall semester. That is not something that the university does. We don't actually think and don't believe it's necessary to secure your housing during the fall semester. And indeed, the ordinances that I mentioned earlier during my presentation section were ordinances brought in by the city of Ann Arbor specifically to slow down the leasing cycle, because students were making commitments on leases really early during the academic calendar, and that was creating a whole bunch of different issues. Those ordinances are relatively new. They only came in 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's fair to say that both students and housing providers themselves are still adjusting to that changing landscape in terms of the leasing cycle slowing down. So there still is that narrative of feeling a pressure to find housing and secure it during the fall semester. The way that I like to think about it and the way that I like to talk about it is that there is a difference between searching and signing. So absolutely use this time now to gather information, come to our housing fair, be on the website, talk to landlords, have all those conversations, gather the information that you can, think about those questions about who you want to live with and your budget and so forth. But you don't need to sign a lease right now. You don't need to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars as a down payment right now. Some landlords may have a wait list. That's different from a lease. They may have a wait list. They may ask you to pay some money to be on their wait list. If you choose to do that, that's your choice. But to my earlier point, be aware of what those break clauses are and whether that is a non-refundable fee or not. And you obviously then have to make a determination about whether or not you want to do that. We have started to see that there is greater interest in terms of signing leases after the winter break, and we start to see that trend shift this year. This current year that we're in was the first time where we saw greater interest in the January-February window than we were seeing in the October-November window. So there is a shift that's starting to happen, but we know it takes time, and we know there's still a lot of information that students hear about finding housing in this period.
Thank you so much. The second question for you, Mark, is has to do with people being able to look and compare costs. And it reminds me of the off-campus living resources that are available and searchable. Can you talk a little bit more or just retouch on some of the points that you covered about how people can search online for the properties available through Beyond the Diag and whether or not someone has to be a UMich student to log in and use that site? And if we have that link, it'd be helpful to make that available to folks, I think, as well.
Yes. So the off-campus housing search website, which is literally just offcampushousing.umich.edu, it allows you to navigate around. If you went to that website, you would see a yellow bar across the top, and it has a number of different tabs. On the far left, of that yellow bar, it has listings. And this, as you might guess, is where all of the current listings are situated. You can then see that there are various different criteria that you can narrow your search by. So you can choose the number of beds, the number of bathrooms, the price. Obviously, the price is usually important to people. And then there's a drop-down tab that says more filters. And that really is where you can select lots of other criteria that can help to narrow your search. So if you're looking for a house, you can select that. If you're looking for a certain length of lease, you can select that. If you're looking for a unit that allows cats or dogs, you can select those. If you want one that has a gym or a swimming pool, all of those are selectable criteria that you can use to narrow down your search. And then you can see on the right-hand side of the page that there is a map function, which, as then you can imagine, you can zoom in and out of, and it will show you all of the properties that match that criteria in a given area. So you can say, all right, I don't really care where I live, but my budget is, a certain amount per month. So you could scroll the map all the way out, say anywhere within a, 5-mile radius of Ann Arbor. And you could see everything that matches to that area. And Rachel very helpfully has just brought up the map, or the website. So you can see it there. And you can see the map there on the right side, and you can scroll around and move in and out, and you can see all those properties popping up. This is information provided by the housing providers, so we don't update this information. This is updated by the housing providers themselves based on what they're saying is their availability. But you can use that to start getting a sense of what is out there and which properties match what you're looking for.
That is very helpful. Thank you, Rachel, for giving folks a chance to just see a preview of what they'll find when they go to that website. And again, they can go to that website with or without their student and be able to search. Thank you, Mark,
Correct.
for working with all of those properties to keep them enrolled in this program so that we can make it a little bit easier for our students to find housing. And then I'll put this out to any of our panelists. Can you share about students who commute? I know that's a term that we might want to talk about what it means at Michigan, but students who are driving to campus every day or planning to drive to campus every day as opposed to using like the buses that are made available. What happens with parking for students who live off campus?
I'm I'm willing to field that. So yeah, the university doesn't have a kind of common definition of what a commuter student is. Some universities do have that definition. We don't use that language as a distinct phrase separate from off-campus students, but we recognize that there are students who don't live in quote unquote student housing and travel to and from campus every day, possibly from further away, and they may see themselves as commuter students. I think there was a question in the Q&A a while back, and it was asking about transportation options in the city. So the first thing to say is Ann Arbor has a pretty good public transportation system, and specifically a bus system provided by the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority. And with your M card, so with your student ID card, it's actually free travel on all of those buses. So with your ID card, you can travel on all of those buses for free. Additionally, the university operates a bus system, often known as our Michigan bus system or our Blue bus system, that provides transportation between the different campuses in Ann Arbor. So that's specifically for the university campuses around the city. So between those two different bus systems, the city is pretty easy to navigate around. To Nicole's question about travel, if, for example, if you're planning to bring your own car to the city, the university does have parking, but a lot depends on what level of study you're at and what, if any, parking accommodations you may be entitled to. If you are an upperclassman or a graduate student, you will likely have more options in terms of parking than if you're a first or second year undergraduate student. If you are a disabled car user, then you will have more access to parking options. The university's logistics, transportation, and parking website can give a lot more detail on that. In terms of where and how to park on campus and those different options available to different students.
There's also my son commutes from home, which is about 20 minutes away. There are several other options that are the park and ride or commuter lots, which Rachel has helpfully just placed in the chat. Those are options where the student can park free and then bus the rest of the way in. And in that case, what Mark was talking about, either their UMID will allow them to get on the Ann Arbor Transportation Authority buses, or the UMesh Blue buses, which are free of charge too. And if they plan it right, which my son doesn't always do well, you're able to know the schedule ahead of time and sort of plan your arrival for roughly when that bus will be showing up to transport onto campus.
Thank you both. I want to give all three panelists a moment to think about this question, and I'll share some information and then come back for their answers. The question I'd ask each of you to think about is what happens when a student lives, Mark, in off-campus apartments, Michael in on-campus properties, and then Travis in chapter facilities. If a student lives in one of those settings and they plan to study abroad over the course of a typical lease, can you each be prepared to talk about that in just a moment? And I'll make this a bit of a commercial break and talk about something different. A question here was raised, and I see it repeated, as families are thinking about their students moving off campus for the future, and they realize their student is currently receiving scholarships, grants, loans. I'll generalize that and call it financial aid to support their tuition, room, board, and fees. The questions I'm seeing about how do students afford living off campus if they're receiving financial aid. I want to give a general answer and make a suggestion. The general answer is that each year, whatever a student qualifies for is going to be posted to their account as long as they're eligible for those different award types and have satisfied whatever the requirements are to receive those awards in a given year, such as a promissory note for loans or a federal aid application for Pell Grant or scholarship awards where they've got to accept it. As long as they take those steps each year, the funds are posted to their student account. The account will first take care of any charges such as tuition and fees to the university, and then the remainder is refunded on a schedule to students. we advise students to take those funds and cover their rent for a semester, and then their living expenses, so rent, utilities, and food, as best as they can stretch those funds to do that. If you have any questions about whether or not your students' award for a future year would be different if they live off campus, this is a good time to talk to financial aid. I say that because the processing for them right now is more focused on mid-year changes than awards for next year. So you may have more opportunity to spend some time and do some Q&A. And our financial aid and student accounts tellers are wonderful. Generous with information, happy to talk about scenarios, and happy to share tools to help you plan your finances for next year. So don't be inhibited about your student living off campus if they're receiving financial aid. The other thing I'd like to mention, I think Michael would mention this if I pitched the question to him, but I asked him to think about something different. I'd like to mention that students who live off campus can still secure on-campus dining plans or meal plans. There are a range of options, just as there are for students who live on campus now. Your student could live off campus for the next 2 or 3 years and continue to use a meal plan for some of their meals or all of their meals. And so we welcome that and can help you learn how to find that information as well. I'm going to find a charger cord for my PC. And as I do that, on my laptop, as I do that, I would ask Travis, then Michael, then Mark, talk to folks about what happens if a student decides to go abroad during the year of a lease in your areas.
Well, first, I'll say the trend generally for students abroad, right, is that you're mostly doing that during your junior or senior year, right? But there might be opportunities for certainly some students may do study abroad their second academic years, which is when most students who live in fraternity and sorority chapter facilities are living in. There are periods, depending on if a student has a leadership role, that they may live in past their sophomore or second year as a student. And because those leases are all individually managed lease, they're all managed very differently, right? And so, but what I can say pretty generally is that our fraternity and sorority local alumni housing board and or the national housing board do recognize and are in partnership with us to know that students here at Michigan study abroad. That's just what we do here at at the University of Michigan. And so many of the chapter facilities are certainly preparing and able to accommodate students who might need to take a break from a lease. What I most often will see is that they'll work with the chapter leadership to find someone to backfill that lease. Because particularly in the sorority case, right, they tend to want to make sure the house is full. And then as students may be transitioning out for a semester for abroad, they may have someone else come in and take that lease temporarily, right? But those are questions, again, certainly encourage folks to be asking as they're thinking about study abroad opportunities and really naming that pretty early on for the sorority or fraternity that you're part of. But typically our fraternity sorority members do not have any issues getting out of a housing agreement in terms of study abroad, but making sure that that is communicated early on.
Thank you.
So Michigan Housing permits students to cancel their contracts if they are going on a university sanctioned study abroad trip, if they are taking a leave of absence, or withdrawing from the institution. So certainly any student that's pursuing an externship, for example, in Chicago, or they're going abroad to Spain, for example, we would ask students to tell us early so that they are what their plans are, but we would then cancel their contract without penalty.
Okay, so
Thank you.
it's a different arrangement for students who live off campus because if you've signed a lease, which if you're already living off campus, you will have done, and that lease will usually be, as I was mentioning earlier, that will normally be for a 12-month period. And if you said to a landlord, hey, would you let me out of my lease early because actually I'm going to study abroad, then I would say 99 times out of 100, the landlord is going to politely decline. So we do, and I'm actually going to share my screen because I will show you the function that we have. If I can do that.
You should be able to share now, Mark.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to bring up, and this is the same site that Rachel showed earlier. You can see again this yellow bar along the top. The third button in it says subleases, and that is where I think we would encourage students to go if they are considering, a study abroad type situation where they think they are going to be out of Ann Arbor and they have this lease remaining. So if you hit that button, you'll see it takes you to a University of Michigan firewall. The student will need to log in and they'll use their university credentials to do that. And that means that the only people who have access to this part of the website are people with a university login. So it is protected, and we have a little kind of scam reminder, making sure people understand we don't want them to be victims of scams. But all of the information on this part of the website is about subleases. And you can just scroll down here. You can see a lot of ads on here that are appearing for the winter semester. So these are things that are created by students, basically advertising their property. Most of these are going to be for a winter start. So you can see January 1st, January 1st, January 1st, Christmas Day, it looks like there. And so many of these will be students who will be studying abroad or not likely to be in the city for the winter semester for some reason, and they can put this on there. This is them basically advertising their property, putting it on there, and then this is where we will direct students who are in need of housing for the winter semester. So people who may be enrolling mid-year, we obviously have study abroad students who come to Ann Arbor, come in the other direction, and we will often direct them here to find a partial year lease or to find a sublease that matches their timeline. And then for a variety of different reasons, students may just need different housing for that winter semester period. And this is really where we'll direct people. It's often a shorter lease period than a traditional lease with the landlord. It may be cheaper, not always, it depends on the situation. And it can often offer some more options in terms of different housing options than just looking for a lease with a housing provider. So we would definitely encourage people to look at that sublease option.
Thank you so much for that. I've had to switch devices. I think it's working out okay. I want to check in, Rachel, for time. There are one or two additional questions I think could be asked right now, unless there are other announcements that you want to use the remaining time for.
Thank you, Nicole. I will just share, again, there have been a lot of questions about recordings. There is an MFamily YouTube channel, so the recordings are all posted on that, and I am going to post the website in the chat. Additionally, we will send out the slides and the question and answers to everyone who is registered for the webinar, regardless of whether they attended tonight. So if your friend or a family member was also registered and didn't get to attend, they will also get all of these things. So I just put in the chat the YouTube channel for everyone. So please note that. And we do have time for one or two more questions. We have about 5 minutes left. I know that there are a lot of questions people have submitted, so bear with us as we try to answer a couple more. And then again, we will send you answers to the questions that we didn't get to later next week.
Thank you. I'll bring one more question. This one is for Michael Zabriskie. Can you talk a little bit about the process of students seeking or expressing interest in becoming RAs for the next year?
Sure. That process is already underway. And so I believe that students, I forget the exact date that the application was to be submitted by, but I know that they are starting interviews next week. So it is their hope to wrap that process up as quickly as possible so that the students and their supporters, such as you that are here on this call, are able to make plans based on that information.
Thank you for that, Michael. And of course, they also can start some of the early phases of training, during the remainder of this academic year, I imagine. So good to have that for those folks who are thinking about that as a possibility for their students. I'm going to switch to Beyond the Diag. And Mark, in addition to all of the resource, all of the functionality of the off-campus living information, that website, Can you talk a little bit about, say a little more about how people might find help to get roommates?
So there is also a button on the website that if you are seeking a roommate or you are someone who wants to become someone's roommate, there is an option on there that can help you navigate to pairing up in that sense. And more generally, I think it's important to say that if you have questions or issues or things that you want to learn about navigating off-campus housing, whether that is literally how to find off-campus housing, or you're already in off-campus housing and you need some advice and support, you can absolutely reach out to us. We have office hours every day, Monday to Friday, in the Dean of Students office, where you can drop in and meet with, a member of the Beyond the Diag team. You can connect with us via Zoom for a remote meeting, on the phone. We have lots of ways of providing that support. But if you have questions, whether it's about roommates or anything else, any of the information we've shared tonight, we are always happy to connect with you and talk that through.
Thank you so much. And I'll conclude there with the questions. Everything else that hasn't been addressed so far is being compiled into a document, as Rachel has mentioned. And so our panelists will still provide helpful information, links, answers to your questions. So I just want to say that to our audience and thank you all. I'll turn it back over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. And I just want to reiterate, I do see some questions coming in. If you Google any of these fraternity, sorority life, housing, or Beyond the Diag, if you Google them and then put UMich afterward, you will come to the websites for all of these things. So I know I have included some websites in the chat, but I will, like I mentioned, send out the slides. We will give you access to the presentation, which is on the YouTube channel, and we will email out all of the questions and answers that we have. So rest assured, there is a lot of information. We understand that, but please, if you are interested, go to the Beyond the Diag website. Just Google Beyond the Diag at UMich, or housing at UMich, or fraternity and sorority life at UMich, and they will take you to those pages. And there is a wealth of information on all of those pages as well. With that, we are going to conclude tonight's conversation. I thank you all for joining and hope you have a great evening. Thank you.